Hello, everyone. My name is Luca Aiken. I'm the host of the Common Ground podcast. Today, I am joined by a very special guest, Mr. Antonio Reis, and we are going to be having a great conversation about Mamdani, the new mayor of the New York City, and how democratic socialism could look for a city like New York. So, Antonio,
Yeah.
could you please introduce yourself, where you're from, what you're doing right now, and why you're joining us?
Hi, I'm Antonio Reis. I'm Portuguese American, but I'm currently studying at the University of Oxford in the UK. I'm studying philosophy, politics, and economics. Super excited to be joining, and I'm excited to start the discussion. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think, getting your perspective, a European perspective, especially a perspective which has been a little bit desensitized to the term socialism. In the US, we people hear that term and they go crazy. They're like, no, that's communism. No, we can't be having that in this country. But it's become quite normalized in Europe, and the left has been using, socialist ideals for quite a while now. So I guess the first question is, what was your initial reaction when Zoran got elected in New York? And what do you think it signals for the political direction of the city?
Yeah, great question. I would say, in very short words, my initial reaction was cautiously optimistic. Which is I'll let me expand a little bit on that. Well, when I'm looking at like Zoran's platform, right, there's a few key things I pick up on. First of all, it's that a big lesson that I think should be taken away is that he ran an amazing campaign. Like just in terms of campaign strategy, right? He very much forward a blueprint for how, even if you're forget Democrats, even Republican politicians in general, he took forward a blueprint of his amazing work on social media, his use of really like small sources of funding rather than large super PACs, like the rampant energy, the enthusiasm, the idea of hope. It was very reminiscent to me, if not politically, at least strategically, of the Obama campaign in 2008, because there was very much this sense of energy, youth, and hope. So even I, like I also got caught up in that. And so in that sense, I say optimistic, right? Because like I think, yeah, let me first talk about what I really like about him. That energy, that youth, that enthusiasm. I think it's great to have a young mayor in New York City. I think it's great that a young generation of Democratic politicians are breaking through, especially when the Democratic Party has been dominated by some quite old politicians the last few years. I do think he will do a good job of standing up to Donald Trump however he can. I mean, he's shown that he's like fiery enough and enthusiastic enough to do so. And I think, and I like, I would like to like him. I think he's exciting, young. He has good, good vibes candidate. Now, why am I cautious? Well, I'm cautiously optimistic because I'm, to put it simply, skeptical of some of his economic policies. Um, I mean, the real elephant in the room here is the rent control. To put it quite simply, I don't think rent control in general is an amazing economic policy. He's proposing effectively freezing the rent on a bunch of rent stabilized units in New York. Now, I think my general understanding of rent control is that while it helps sitting tenants in the short run, it also hurts the broader housing market over time by shrinking supply, discouraging investment, and by trapping tenants in kind of inefficient or deteriorating units. Now, what do I mean? Let me use some examples because there's been rent control proposed throughout for a while in throughout different places in the world. So I have some examples brought on. Well, rent control was actually proposed for a while in New York City a while back, and the results were that there was lower mobility amongst stabilized tenants versus market rate housing. So there's less mobility in the housing market. So it kind of like slowed down. So if beyond that, higher things like high reports of rodents in stabilized housing and problems with maintenance. Um, because the fundamental problem is, if you think about the economics of it, what rent control is effectively a ceiling on the housing market. It's
Yeah.
an effective price ceiling. And while that helps the tenants, and it does help the tenants in the short run, I'm not disagreeing with that. In the long run, it discourages producers and it discourages people who own and maintain these houses from maintaining them because the limited rent increases don't come close to the actual costs of rewiring, plumbing, building codes, lead abatement laws, these basic improvements that you need. So what ends up happening is something like what happened to rent control in San Francisco, where when it was implemented there in the 1990s, what ends up happening is a bunch of people who own properties and can no longer make the amount of profit they need to maintain them just switch their housing to Airbnbs or other non-controlled forms of housing so they can acquire those high rents and that actually decreases the supply of housing in the long run. I mean, we see some other examples in Stockholm. There was a record in August of 2023, there was a record high 810,000 people on the waiting list for rental controls. In Stockholm, that's a pretty tight rental market with rent control. Berlin, sharp decline of rental advertisements to the point where rent control in Berlin was even repealed in 2021. New York, the supply of available renting housing actually decreased by 15% over the years it was implemented. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, even abolishing rent control added around 1.8 billion to the value of Cambridge's housing stock, and the investments in buildings doubled. Now, all of this is kind of, I don't want to make this a podcast about rent control. All this is to pretty much say that rent control is one of those ideas that I think helps people in the short run, but in the long run, I think can be quite problematic. So that's why I'm cautious, because the way I look at this is coming back to Mamdani. Um, rent it's the kind of thing where his rent control policy could be really good in the short run, but for it to be successful in the long run, he'll also have to tackle the fundamental problem in New York, which is that over the last however many years, there has been an increase in population, there's been an increase in demand, there has not been an increase in supply.
Exactly.
New York has been, and what happens when you have more people competing for less stuff? Prices go up.
Yeah.
Now, I will say this, I'm not gonna entirely, decry Mamdani's campaign because he has addressed this. He's pledged to build 200,000 publicly subsidized rent stabilized units over the next 10 years, which does solve the problem. So, this is why I'm cautious, because if he does rent control and then builds the houses, I think you get kind of a best of both worlds thing, where in the short run, you kind of freeze the rent, but in the long run, you don't have the problems with rent control that comes because you build the houses. But I'm cautious because building those houses is not easy. It's got a high cost per unit, there's implementation risks, and it involves him getting over a series of hurdles. He'll probably have to at some point negotiate and fight with the labor unions of New York City, which might really annoy some of the more progressive people in New York because he'll have to kind of negotiate there and get that passed through. Um, so that's kind of the elephant in the room, the question of rent control. Because if it goes badly, it could go really badly. But if it goes well, I think he could really thread the needle into something good here. Now, what about Mandani's other policies? I mean, he wants to raise corporate tax to 2%. I'm not gonna like fear monger about like people are gonna leave New York. I think New York is a place people are gonna want to live regardless of what the taxes are. What I do think is that he needs the permission of Governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, to increase taxes, which is something he'll have to convince her of, which is she's been hesitant on.
Yeah.
In terms of
Touching
his
on
other,
that, I mean,
yeah, yeah,
touching on that exact point, which you just said about people, the mass exodus, that's what that's what Cuomo ran on in a way that Mamdani was going to tax the wealthy
yeah,
out of New York. And Bill Ackman, a large hedge fund manager who's based in New York, along with a group of other billionaires, invested $25 million to try to get Mamdani not elected, right?
yeah.
However, after Mamdani was elected, Ackman tweeted, and I don't have the exact quote, but he tweeted something along the lines of "Congratulations, Mamdani,"
Hmm.
kind of essentially not supporting him, but being coy, like being like, we appreciate you, whatever, and saying we're here for New York if you need us. I mean, the reality is people don't leave New York because New York is it's kind of right now the center of what's going on in the
It's the
United
major
States. It's the
city.
capital of capitalism. And
Yeah.
these men work and these men and women work in the business of capitalism. And that's it at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think the fears that people are going to flood out of the financial center of the world are a little bit overblown. Now, I think he's going to have to get those permission to raise those taxes. He has to get governor's permission. Now, that's a challenge. But I don't think the fears of Ackman and these guys that like raising their income tax by 2% over, like, I don't think there's going to be necessarily that impact. In
No.
terms of his other policies, the city-owned grocery stores thing are kind of, I think, it's not a look, he's gonna build like five. Maybe they go well. I don't see them being a massive good or massive bad. I'm gonna be completely honest. Like I just don't think there'll be like it's one of those like things that like looks really good on paper, but in terms of substantive improvements, I don't see it being a massive crisis or a massive improvement.
Yeah.
Um, Childcare, great idea, very expensive. $6 billion a year. He's going to need funding. Where's he going to get that funding from? Great question. We don't know. Hopefully federal funding, but if Trump decides to pick a fight with him, that could be a problem. Or state funding, but again, then he has to negotiate with Hochul. Now, It's interesting you brought up at the start of this kind of the idea of Mamdani as a democratic socialist, because that's actually something I've been finding interesting when we talk about the political direction of New York City.
Yeah,
Because while I think Mamdani calls himself a democratic socialist, I don't really consider him a democratic socialist. Because frankly, I think he's shown a willingness throughout his campaign to really moderate his positions to get elected, which happens in most political campaigns when you switch from the primary to the general, you moderate a lot of your positions. Like he's kind of he's softened. He went from saying like defund the police to pretty much softening that rhetoric to like his whole Department of Public Safety. I mean, for a long time, people were trying to tag the whole globalize the intifada thing on him, and he pretty much just kind of like said like, no, I do not associate myself with that.
yeah,
So he's been doing a really good job of all the stuff people would try to tag him onto as a radical, pretty much like distancing himself from that, from saying like, this is not, I'm not going to associate myself with these physical positions, which I think also means that like it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing if he moderates his position, if he's willing to kind of lean more to more moderate positions. But like what else is an example? He was willing to go on like, there's a recent book that came out over the summer by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, Abundance. It's been making really big waves in like kind of the center left Democratic Party community. He was willing to show up on Derek Thompson's podcast. He's pledged to consider retaining the current commissioner of the NYPD, which is kind of not which is like shows that he's willing to consider and retain a lot of the old guard, and he's willing to
yeah,
be moderate,
yeah,
which I think is a good thing. I don't think like, and maybe this is more of my more center left predispositions coming out, but I think it's good that, as part of politics, he's had to maybe shift a little bit more to the center. And that means what I like about him is that he's willing to do that. He's willing to say, here's my principles, but I'm willing to negotiate and I'm willing to do what gets to get done. It's pragmatic rather than being ideological.
yeah,
And I think that's
absolutely.
important.
I think that's very important as well. I'd have to agree. And I'd have to say, so I've been following Mamdani and his campaign since he had 100,000 followers on Instagram, which was 10 months ago.
Yeah, it's
And I've
crazy.
seen the
Crazy.
climb. And, the first thing, when I first saw him, I was super excited. And I learned a little bit about his policies and I was a little bit less excited. But, I think you were right in saying we do need a new young mayor in New York. I think that's crucial. I think he can serve as a great foil to Trump, you know,
Yes.
but also in the same light, he's kind of doing the opposite of what this podcast intends to do, which is to come together in the middle. He's going further left, and Trump is going to continue to go further right. Now we can talk about if that's going to change the kind of the landscape of American politics as a whole, if that's going to change the face of the Democratic Party. But nonetheless, I think some good could come out of his election. The main things that concern me, which you've addressed, which are he's very young, he doesn't have that much experience, and his policies are radical and don't work in a lot of cases, especially rent stabilization and free supermarkets. We look at countries like Cuba, Venezuela, where a lot of immigrants have come to New York to live, making up a population of almost a million. And they're very concerned, and they didn't vote for him, and they're very concerned about his policies, understandably, because they've seen firsthand that a lot of these things don't work, that a lot of these communist and socialist ideals don't work in practice, which
Mhm.
leads me to the question, you touched on it, but you've seen firsthand socialism in play in Europe, in Portugal. I've seen it in Spain. We've seen it in Scandinavia. So do you think it could work? You have you seen it work in Europe to some
Mhm.
extent? And do you think something like that could work in the US? Or is the culture just entirely different?
Well, I think there's a few important distinctions to make here. First of all, we should be clear that what happens in Europe, especially in Western Europe, is not socialism. It's welfare capitalism. It's capitalism with a strong social democratic welfare state, right? And in terms of what that has produced, I think a lot of what it's produced has been great. Comprehensive social safety nets, reducing poverty, inequality, higher living standards, longer life expectancy, like these are good things. Now, and so, like, growing up in Europe, I agree that I'm not necessarily scared of these ideas in the same way that I think people in the US might be. I would like to see the US have stronger social safety nets. I would like to see the US have lower wealth inequality. I would like to see kind of a world where, the US has no trouble being a global dynamo in terms of like creating new things, building new things. I would like to see a world where it takes some of the inspiration from Europe to have those social safety nets and to also care for those who are left behind. Um, but what's the cost of these large welfare states? Well, the cost is that they're expensive. They require higher taxes. They require, certain regulations, etc. And for the longest time, I think Western Europe was pretty comfortable with that deal. It was a deal, Western European countries made. I am okay with higher taxes. I am okay with maybe slower economic growth. I'm okay with all these things because I get higher living standards. And I think that's a respectable deal to make, right?
Yeah.
However, the problem I think we're running into in Western Europe now is that it's gotten to a point of stagnation where there is no, like, there's no more, like, I think what's the statistic? The last 20 years or something, the United Kingdom's economy has grown 0.7%, right? Which is so at a certain point, I almost feel like the United States and Europe are facing different problems where
Yeah.
the US has no problem with growth. The US has no problem with new industries. It's always inventing new things, it's always creating new things, but it doesn't have the social safety nets. Meanwhile, in Europe, we've got the social safety nets. We've got the NHS. We've got in Portugal, we've got the public services. These are amazing things that I like, but we don't have the growth. There's no
Yeah.
new businesses in Europe. There's really a lot of struggle to kind of attract this investment, to attract this incentive, to attract this risk taking. Like there's a joke which is a bit hyperbolic, but I think it's kind of funny to come up with like the idea of if these restrictions had existed in Europe, the internet could not have been founded in Europe
Yeah.
because it did not have because the ability of American companies to kind of grow and take risks and kind of expand that production is struggles in Europe. So I think we need, I mean, the Draghi report, which is this big economics report put out by Mario Draghi in like 2024, I think detailed it pretty well. Europe is struggling with competitiveness. It's struggling with innovation. It's struggling with kind of being competitive in a modern world. So to kind of really answer your question, I'm not scared of socialism in the same way as I am in the US because a lot of what I think people think is socialism in the US is not socialism. You can have a capitalist country like Sweden that has good welfare states and is still capitalist. You can have countries in Western Europe that are not socialist, that are capitalist, but have strong welfare states. So I'm not scared of the welfare state. I think it's great, and I think the US needs to try to implement more of a welfare state. I think there needs to be investment in public transport. There needs to be investment in universal healthcare. There needs to be investment in all these kind of important public resources. That being said, I'm also aware as a European that these things are not perfect, that they come with costs. And assuming that Western Europe is this perfect honeymoon place where no one ever struggles and there's no economic problems is also inaccurate, right? Because Western Europe struggles with growth, it struggles with innovation. And I don't think the United States should sacrifice its growth and its innovation for that.
Yeah.
But I think there's a way to make both work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. I think there's definitely a way to make both work. I think what's really dangerous about this whole thing, which goes back to what you touched on, which is that it's not necessarily socialism, but we throw these terms around because it's inflammatory, it garners attention, and you know, I don't know if Mamdani could have gotten the attention he did if he didn't claim himself as, such a pivotal figure as he was, being Muslim, being the first elected Muslim mayor in the whole country,
Yeah.
regarding himself as a democratic socialist, which he touched on again within his speech, and kind of being ruthless. I think that helped him get elected, but now once he is elected, it would be great for him to really understand more demographics within New York. We were speaking about this at school a couple of days ago, just the idea how he clearly appeals to a different demographic and a different group of people than both you and I are. People who are in a way left behind, but also people who are just struggling and really are having a very tough time. And that's a lot of people in New York. That's a lot of people. But where I'm trying to go with this is he needs to also focus on things that help everyone. So that is safe public transport. Doesn't necessarily need to be fast and free. Well, we'd like it to be fast, but it doesn't necessarily need to be free, but safe and clean. Safe streets. Sometimes my sister's living in New York now. She goes to NYU and it's a jungle, like literally. Sometimes it reminds me a little bit of it gives me like anarchy vibes. Just like people can literally do whatever they want. I was in a Walgreens and a couple of guys came in with masks on. They grabbed some chips and they ran outside. And I was buying some things and I looked at the clerk and I go, "You're not going to stop them?" And she goes, we can't. We legally can't stop them. And so it's things like that that concern me and concern a lot of New Yorkers.
Mhm.
And I think that also needs to be addressed. But you're right. We can touch on both of these things. What's
And
very dangerous is the tossing around of terms which are inflammatory, like fascist, like
yeah.
socialist,
Mhm.
like authoritarian, and that's being done by both sides, and that needs to be stopped. So that kind of leads me into the third segment of this conversation, which is how have you seen in Europe um, far left or left parties responding to the far right movements? So in Spain, that may be Vox, the far right movement, and PSOE trying to go further left, or in Portugal or in the UK as well. So how have you seen that come into play?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge that's happening in Europe to far right movements. I think it's also a challenge that's happening, especially with when we talk about how the Democratic Party responds in the US. Um, I would say, um, I think, well, there's been varying levels of success. I mean, a few days ago, in the Netherlands, the kind of this center left party headed D66, I think it's called, like won massively in their election against the current far right government. So I don't think first of all, I don't think it's a good idea to be pessimistic. Like the idea like, oh, the far right are coming and there's nothing we can do to stop them. That's not true. The second you give yourself into pessimism, things go very badly. Like D66 in the Netherlands shows that, you can win. And I think I think so what kind of comes up with how should left-wing parties in Europe respond to the rise of far right movements? Well, I think the idea of the cordon sanitaire is very important. Like this idea of like parties in the center basically effectively making an informal agreement that we will not let the far right in.
Yeah,
Like in Portugal, there's a cordon sanitaire where the current government is a center right government, but they have like officially stated on multiple occasions, no matter what, we will not form a coalition with the far right party. Like
yeah,
this is just not going to happen. Um, and I think in some way, I worry that in the UK, for example, the Conservatives have failed to do that. They've let themselves be subsumed by the far right party by reform.
yeah,
Um, so I think that idea of like a cordon sanitaire of like an agreement amongst moderates of like I may disagree with someone who's to the left of me. I may disagree with someone who's to the right to me. I may disagree with someone with a lot of different people who I even have very similar opinions to me. But I think we can all agree of a greater threat of the idea of the threat of far right movements in Europe. And that kind of shared alliance, that big tent, is super important, both in the US or the UK. Like the worst thing parties in the US or in Europe can do right now with the rise of the far right is to be internally divided, right? To divide ourselves over our differences rather than our commonalities.
yeah,
Because no matter how much I might disagree with someone who shares these feelings, I think I agree with them more than I agree with them more than I could ever agree with someone who's from the far right.
yeah,
So that idea of a big tent, that idea of is important. Also the idea of, Mamdani in New York is a very singular case because it's a very progressive city, obviously. But what I do think people center and center left politicians can take away from everywhere is focusing on pragmatic issues, focusing on affordability, right? Rather than like focusing on, you said crime. Crime's also important too. Focusing on the issues that impact people in every single way of their lives, on the economy, on affordability, because that kind of cuts through a lot of the really complicated rhetoric of the inflammatory name calling, if you want, of, we can call Mamdani this, we can call Mamdani that, but when people heard what he was saying, they heard someone talking about the issues that impacted them, which were
yeah,
cost of living, which were affordability, which were rents. These are grounded, real things that people can connect to. And center left parties or center right parties or moderate parties in general, I think can cut through the nonsense of the far right if they focus on affordability, if they focus on the real grounded issues that impact people in everyday life, right? And then by doing that, forming these broad coalitions, and I think that can work. That would be where I would go right now.
I totally agree with that last statement you just said, being that if center parties and moderate parties can cut through the fat, that would be incredible. What's unfortunate in my eyes, and which has happened a lot around Europe, and why I think far right movements have grown in popularity, is because they've alienated a group of people, immigrants, right? They've alienated the others, whether that be immigrants, whether that be the rest of Europe. Um, but what that's done is by doing that, they have blamed the country's issues on that group of people, therefore blaming immigrants on affordability, saying, well, the government is spending millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to put up immigrants in hotels in Spain, for example, or in the UK, and you can't even afford rent. It's things like that, which to some extent may be true, yes, but it is not their fault. And, you know, we can't simply blame all problems. We can't scapegoat a country's issues, economic issues, on other people and not on the mismanagement of the country, right?
Yeah. And also to be clear, in most of these well, it's two things. First of all, painting a group as an other throughout history, right? No matter what group it is a very effective political tactic because if you're not part of that other, you like feel this solidarity and then you kind of have somewhere to direct all your anger at your life. But it's also fear mongering, right? It's not like are immigrants being put up in asylum hotels or whatever in the UK and Spain? Yeah, yes. And is immigration something that should be addressed in Europe and in the US and wherever? Yeah, sure. But there are moderate, sensible ways to do this. And what is not moderate or sensible is to lie, is to say like, oh, the immigrants are taking all your jobs, or oh, the immigrants are like, they're coming here and they're like assaulting everyone, or that, we're letting in 7 billion immigrants every single day, which is just like it's fear mongering because it makes people scared and fear sells. And so, yeah, I completely agree with you. This demonization of other groups of people where I think what I think moderate parties should do in response to that is not to deny, like they should not say, oh, immigration is like no problem at all. Like obviously it should be like, okay, if there's people coming in who are coming in and breaking, immigration law, then you have to, that's a problem that you should deal with. But very importantly, you should not lie about the scale of the problem, right?
Yeah.
You should not think it's more. And B, you can propose solutions. I mean, I remember in like the last year of his term, Biden proposed a border bill, right? That would increase funding for asylum judges. That would increase funding for the exact systems that are meant to legally process people coming into the United States. That would do a large amount of things to solve it. And guess who told Republicans to veto that bill? Donald Trump. Because fundamentally, these far-right parties don't care about immigration. They don't care about solving the problem. They care about using the problem. Donald Trump cared about using immigration to win the election. He doesn't actually care, right? If he cared, he would have backed the bipartisan funded immigration bill that had solutions, that would have funded asylum courts, that would have given resources to the actual legal mechanisms rather than just making racist claims by people who look different than him. Like, there are solutions. They can be proposed. But that doesn't work. And what Democrats or Labor or whatever parties we're talking about, needs to acknowledge that it's a problem, but then focus on the right solutions and do not let the solutions be ceded to the far right. Do not let voters think the only people dealing with this problem are the far right.
Yeah,
That
which
would
is
be
that's exactly what a lot of people are thinking right now, which is very concerning. Yeah. Well, thank you. That was a great point. Thank you so much. Um, Kind of circling back, and then we'll close out, but circling back to what we talked about at the beginning of this conversation about Mamdani and about, the face of the Democratic Party. I'm wondering, is this the right move for the Democratic Party to to have their face be, yes, young, but farther left? So people like Mamdani, like Gavin Newsom, like AOC. Is this the right move for the Democratic Party? And what could this mean for US politics as a whole, in your eyes?
Yeah, right. So obviously there's a lot of further left people in the US, especially further left Democrats who are like, yes, Mamdani, AOC, Sanders, whatever, they're like the voice of, well, less Sanders, but like they're the voice, these young Democrats are the voice of the future, right? And now, are they the face of the Democratic Party? Like, I think there's this big conversation, especially amongst Democrats, center and left-wing parties in general, over like right now to respond to far right, do we drag the party further left? Do we keep it in the center? What do we do? What I would say is, I would say neither. I don't think the party should be dragged further to the left. But here's what I'll say. Mamdani got people to come out in New York. He's a young, exciting candidate. And it would be foolish of Democrats to not recognize the fact that people voted for him, that he's popular, right? That he has ideas that people like. However, Mamdani was also not the only election on Tuesday, right? The New York election, there was Prop 50 in California, and then there was some races in Georgia, but the two ones I'd like to focus on were in New Jersey and Virginia. where in both states, in that situation, Democrats ran centrist Democrats, center-left Democrats, and what happened? Well, in Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, right? And in New Jersey, Mikey Sherrill, right, were the two Democratic nominees. It was expected to be a win for the Democrats, yes, but a close win. And in the end, it was a landslide for the Democrats, right? Plus 15 points. Spanberger won Virginia by more points than Mamdani won New York in a
Yeah.
purple state.
Yeah.
Or not a purple state, but in a close, it was supposed to be a close election. So what does this tell me? It tells me that Mamdani is great, that Mamdani can win in New York. Spanberger can win in Virginia. We should not try to make Mamdani win in Virginia. We should not try to make Spanberger win in New York. We should not force one of these strategies in places where it doesn't fit. Pick candidates who are a good place, who are a good fit for the places where they are running. Sherrill and Spanberger had experience in the military and national security. They appealed to the more purple voters in those areas. The Democratic Party does not win by being dragged to the left and losing center voters. It does not win by staying in the center and losing, the more passionate progressive base that Mamdani called on. It wins by being what it always has thrived on being and what it's lost its potential to be recently, which is a big tent. The Democratic Party can be somewhere. The Democratic Party can simultaneously have AOC and Pete Buttigieg. It can simultaneously have Gavin Newsom and Bernie Sanders. It can simultaneously have Zohran Mamdani and Abigail Spanberger, right? It is that by having that big tent that so I'm not gonna, there's a socialist who wants to talk to me and say like, this is evidence that like, the entire Democratic needs further left, I would say no, right? Spanberger won Virginia by more points than Mamdani won New York, right? What Mamdani proposed in very cosmopolitan progressive New York is not going to work in rural Iowa. It's not. What you can take lessons that focus on affordability is good. You can take lessons that certain social media messaging is good, but but putting the cart before the horse and assuming that like everything about Zohran, that you just have to copy and paste Zohran Mamdani in all 50 states and the Democrats will win, 538 or like that's not gonna work.
Yeah.
But I don't think, I'm not going to disavow Mamdani. I'm not going to say like, oh, he's, should not be part of the Democratic Party. I think it's good that progressive Democrats are getting fired up because we need progressive Democrats and we need centrist Democrats to win in 2028 and 2026. So yeah, do I think it's a shift that there's these new rising progressive factions that should be taken seriously. However, to let those factions dictate what happens and to assume that that's the only way forward and there cannot be a multi-pronged approach, I think is unrealistic and will lose votes because yeah.
Yeah. I completely agree. Thank you so much. That was a great point. And that brings me to kind of a little bit of a closing question, which is, do you think the ideological divide is widening both in Europe? Well, let's focus on the US right now. You think it's widening? You think it's closing? What do you think we can do to close it, if so?
I think I think it's widening. Um, I think, periods of time in political history are like marked by kind of like a status quo, and then like something radically changes. Like in the US, you could say that was the Great Depression, which marked the era of New Deal Democrats, right? But then that was ended by the election of Reagan, which marked a neoliberal era, which someone could even say only ended with Trump. That's a like minor conversation. What I mean to say is that we are currently, I think, in a period of rewriting the rules, right? Like the old political order of liberalism is being challenged by illiberal forces, particularly the far right, but some could also argue the far left. Um, and the playing field is widening. We are a lot more ideas are getting thrown into the ring, right? And which is justifiably causing people concern. Um, Now, I think to a certain extent, I would caveat by saying that people like people have the same concerns that they did 20 years. People care about the same fundamental things. It's just that there's this growing sentiment that the establishment is not working,
Yeah.
right? In whatever direction. Um, and I think, um, and that leads to more ideological division. I mean, social media divides us like crazy, with algorithms, motivated reasoning kind of pushes people apart. And they get kind of fed these simple, easy, populist solutions that can work on everything. Now, I would like to say, I say this. This is I say this with a broader widening view of politics, but I do want to make one thing clear. In the US right now, the far left and the far right do not pose equal threats to the United States right now. There's like, I think there's sometimes this like both sides rhetoric that gets thrown around. There is one party in charge of the Congress. There is one party who has routinely violated the Constitution in the last 9 months, who has routinely, put tariffs that are working to destroy the U.S. economy. There is one party that deports citizens without due process. There is one party that, likes to think of the president as a king, right, going against the entire founding ideals of the United States, right? This is not the Democrats. Like to say that like if one day Zohran Mamdani gets into power and establishes a totalitarian communist state in the United States, then we'll have that conversation then. Right now, the most pressing threat to the United States is the authoritarian tendencies of Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And that's not me trying to point fingers. That's just me saying the reality of the situation. But I would say the political frame is widening. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the political frame doesn't necessarily need to close in the sense of restrict ideas, restrict
Mhm.
perspective, but it's more so come together, find common ground, and stop using scapegoating, stop using the blaming of others, and start taking accountability for one's own faults.
Mhm.
If the government has been closed now for more than 30 days,
Longest
it's
shutdown in U.S.
longest shutdown in U.S. history, and it is
Yeah,
absolutely ridiculous.
from the great deal maker himself. you
Yeah,
know?
exactly. And if we can't come together, if our government can't come together and reopen itself, how can us as a people come together? Right. So I think that's square one. I think square one is finding commonalities and actually, addressing fundamentals, which is the well-being of American people.
Yeah.
Right. However, by blaming each other, we're not going to get anywhere. And so, yes, I really appreciate your thought on that. And this is my question I love to ask all my guests, which is if you could give one message to the youth on how to come together, what would it be?
It's a good question. In one message, I mean, a few of them, but probably the most important thing would be, and that is the spirit of this podcast, and that's why I think it's like such a great thing you've got going on over here, which is actually talk to people. Like throughout my life, I have found that the majority of the time when I think I strongly disagree with someone, or that I have like some deep ideological division, the easiest thing to kind of figure out a solution is to actually sit down with them in person and talk to them. I think a lot of what we can point to has been the kind of decline of like political cohesion, the rise of political violence, is that people get their news from social media and people are like all people read is whatever their social media algorithm feeds them. When in reality, I really do believe that if you go out into the world and you take the time to listen and you take the time to talk to people in person, if you really fight for those deep interpersonal bonds, that going out into the world and finding a common ground, right? You will find that people, even though we think the political frame is widening, it's not really that much wider than we ever thought it was.
Yeah.
Because we have lost this idea of connection, of interpersonal relationships, of going out into the world and like when you do politics, do it in person and try to listen. And because you will find that 99 times out of 100, you will always have more in common with someone who you're talking to than you think. Because at the end of the day, we're all just human beings, all trying to find the best for ourselves and for the societies we live in.
Yeah.
So yeah, that would be what I'd say.
And I think I really appreciate that. I think more than anything, it's really valuable to question your own beliefs at times
Mhm.
and to
Yeah.
question other beliefs while still being respectful. A quote I love is if you cannot explain why you believe what you believe, it's not your belief, it's someone else's. And I think that rings really true, especially in this age in which we are hearing crazy things from both sides on social media, especially, and even in the news. And we believe these things, not necessarily having backing or not necessarily kind of confronting them with ourselves and really understanding why we have these beliefs. So by having these conversations like we're having today, you can reconcile these thoughts. You can understand, am I really believing in this far right ideal, or has it just been pushed to me through propaganda? Am I really believing in socialism? Do I really think socialism can work, or democratic socialism in the United States? Or am I somewhere where I just think Americans need help? So
Mhm.
I think it's really powerful. And I really appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. It was
This was a
genuine.
great conversation, and I loved your perspective.
Awesome.
So
Thank you
thank
very
you so
much.
much.
All right.